Everybody online tells women to decenter men, but nobody really stops to explain what that actually means. Does it mean staying single? Does it mean never dating? Does it mean not wanting marriage? Does it mean hating men? Or does it mean something much more complicated than that? Now, here's the thing. I've talked about decentering men over on Substack in quite some detail. I think I did do one TikTok video rather on this in the past, because I think people really misunderstand what decentering men actually is. Okay, and quite often some of these terms are coined either on social media or in social activism or in academic spaces. Can be both, one of. And then they obviously spill out into a lot of mainstream conversation and kind of colloquial language that gets, thrown around online. And so sometimes the original meaning and maybe intention of a phrase or a term starts to get lost. And then we see all different types of corners of the internet start to interpret that word as they see fit. And the evidence of that is quite often when I see a lot of people saying things like, well, if you're decentering men, why are you talking about men? Why is all your content about men if you're decentering men? And what that often reveals to me is a misunderstanding fundamentally of what it means to decenter men when it's being used properly. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is go through what I call the 5 dimensions of decentering men, because quite frankly, it is not only about whether or not you are dating men, because if you, for example, are not heterosexual, you can still decenter men. And actually, there's some good reasons as to why you may decenter maleness, for example, in your life. So we're going to talk about that today, because I think that this is something that people are quite often quite confused about, okay? The first thing I'm going to say is this. We do live in a world where systems of power in particular, like religion, culture, the family system, education, social media, in fact, at times is a system of power. We live in a world where systems of power have enabled maleness, and maleness has authority. Okay, so this is the first thing you have to understand. When we're talking about decentering men, we're not merely talking about on an interpersonal level between one man and one woman. There are often macro and broader systemic aspects to decentering men. Now, it's become a bit of a slogan, and yes, sometimes it might even be used as a way to, I don't know, accuse people, right? You have people who may even mock this whole idea of decentering men. But you have to understand that structurally, systems of power have enabled maleness to be superior, okay, to any other gender, quite frankly. And so it's very important to understand that decentering men is not the same as ignoring men, okay? And it's merely recognizing that when we analyze a social system, we are analyzing often what has historically occupied power or the center of society. Okay, so for example, if someone studies capitalism, it doesn't mean they're obsessed with money. Yeah, if that's their content, it doesn't mean that they're obsessed with money. If someone studies racism, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're obsessed with race in every single facet, okay? It's very important for us to understand that fundamental difference, because essentially when we're talking about decentering men in its true sense, in my view, we're studying the organizing system. And we live in a world, okay, where systems are organized for the most part around male authority, male power, male prevalence, right? So hang with me here. So let's go through the 5 dimensions of decentering men. The first one is psychological. Okay, whose approval determines your worth? You've seen me talk very often in other videos about the fact that women have been trained and conditioned to deify men in their minds and hearts. They idolize, okay, the opinion of a man, the selection of a man, the approval of man, and being chosen by men. Okay, and so this is where you'll find a lot of conversation around the need for male validation. around women whose self-esteem, identity, and self-worth is fundamentally organized around men. Okay. And the belief that being chosen by a man makes you valuable. Okay, now we know, and we could do a whole other video on this. I've talked about marriage in other videos and how it is a system of power. Okay, so we know that there is structural benefit and privilege to a woman, okay, when it comes to marriage. But we're talking about on this psychological level, the way you see yourself, your identity, and your worth as a woman. So, yes, a lot of the time when you hear women talk about, internalized misogyny, when we see women criticizing maybe the behavior of certain women, the things that they're willing to do to get chosen by a man, even if that means causing harm to other women who, for example, will, allow their children to be abused and neglected in favor of keeping the male partner that they have. Okay, women who don't want their, husband to show any kind of general act of kindness towards other women, right? That is when you start seeing comments around internalized misogyny, but also decenter men, male-centered women. Because there actually is, when you are centered on, prioritizing a man's view of you, bearing in mind men are human beings, they are not gods. They are human beings. They are imperfect human beings just like you. They are our peers. I say that quite often. They are our peers. They're not up here. They are our peers. We are all human beings with intrinsic human value. So that's psychological decentering of men. The second is ideological. So whose ideas and beliefs and traditions and customs and preferences organize your life? Now, examples of this, of course, are gender roles. A lot of gender roles can't actually be proven. I know people worked really hard to, support every gender role they prefer with biology. Most gender roles that we see at play now cannot actually be proven and unequivocally, substantiated with biology alone. Most gender roles are conditioning. That's what they are. Whether it's social, cultural, religious, it's conditioning at the heart of it. Okay, religion, for example, a lot of ideological beliefs around male superiority are rooted in religion, cultural expectations. Okay, so when we're thinking ideologically, why do you believe something? Where did that come from? Who decided that was true? Who decided that was real and accurate and credible? Who decided that the way you see yourself as a woman is right? So you can ideologically decenter men. And sometimes that's about, for example, reading, works and theories and thought leadership by women, for example. Okay, you'd be surprised when you look at, for example, podcasts and books that are written globally, it's still relatively a lower percentage that are written by women. Textbooks in academic environments. Yeah, some of the major schools of thought in psychology, philosophy. And if you do your research, you'll find that some of these prominent men who were thought to be geniuses of their time actually sometimes stole work from the women in their lives or took credit, okay, for the inventions of the women in their life, because it was a time where as a woman, you couldn't be educated or you would not be recognized, okay, as the founding, thought leader, for example. And so ideologically, you can decenter maleness. You can decenter the world's preference for deferring to men being superior in thinking, belief, tradition, and customs. And this is incredibly important, and it can liberate you as a woman. The third area that you can, or dimension of decentering men, is financial. Can you survive without male provision? A lot of the people who've kind of met me along the way over the last 9 months, the gateway often to this work has been the fact that I openly and regularly remind you that money does not come from or through men. They do not have a specialist knowledge about money that women do not. They do not deserve money more than women deserve money. And actually, for many reasons, okay, we really need to detach this idea that money equals the man, that men are only really valuable when they have money and they're giving you money as a woman. Okay. Money is a renewable resource. It is not owned by men. And so when we're talking about financially decentering a man, we're really talking about things like your income, housing, your savings, your economic dependence. Now, the obvious thing here is, of course, when we're all children, if you happen to have a father that provides, that's different, okay? Because he's a parent. That's what he should be doing. But we're talking about adult women. A lot of women, there are things in life that they haven't done because they're waiting on a man to pay for it. There are women who cannot literally pay their own bills as an adult because they believe that money comes from or through men. They might be in a marriage where they are not generating any of their own income. The income for that household comes from that man. And so they're in a situation where their well-being, shelter, food, and clothing is reliant on a flawed, fallible human being who, if his mood changes, if his love disappears or dissipates, so will that money. And so it's about decentering men financially and occupying your life like an adult woman. This is probably one of the most important ways you can decenter men, regardless actually of your marital status, quite frankly. Okay, it is very, very important. And a lot of the time when women are focused on debating what it means to decenter men, a lot of them are still dependent as adult women on adult men for sustenance, food, and clothing. That is immature. That's what that is. Because when you are functioning psychologically like an adult, when you are operating like an adult financially, you are not dependent upon a man as an adult woman to provide to provide for you. Okay. And actually the women who are dependent upon men, it means they have to center that man. Yeah, because often the trade-off is that you center him and his needs and desires. That's the trade-off. That's why it's actually quite challenging. And for many reasons that we can talk about, it's challenging for married women to decenter men. There, obviously, as we go through these dimensions, there are ways that you can decenter men. And I've talked about how married women, if at all possible, can decenter men in detail in an essay on Substack. But, it's actually very challenging. When you are dependent upon somebody, they are the center because you rely on them for your survival. And that survival is not just financial. We know that money is never just maths. It's also emotional. Again, marriages are made up of multiple elements. And with the fact that a lot of women are still getting married because of love, apparently, even though you can remain unmarried, even if you're in love, this is my point. There's much more involved in marriage often than just the money. And so decentering a man when you're married is very difficult. I would also argue that we see what happens when people neglect, their partners. If you're in a healthy relationship, it's not going to be helpful to neglect them, right? So there's a balance there to be had in terms of having a healthy interpersonal relationship in a marriage. This is why it's quite foolish when I see women, generally speaking, saying that they can decenter men and be married. Now, I think there are some dimensions around finances, like I said, ideological decentering. But it's very hard to do in reality, which is why the fourth dimension that I often talk about is structural. This is hard for a married woman because we're talking about where your time, money, and attention go fundamentally. Now, the thing is, there is an aspect of this that you can probably still achieve if you are a married woman. And that could be things like investing in other women. Now, that can be financial investment, that can be emotional investment, that can be supporting the pursuits and the interests of other women. friendships, for example, supporting female businesses, mentoring other women, building female networks, because those things contribute to women structurally progressing. And so, where does your time, money, and attention go? That can be a way often to decenter men, because sometimes by default, women can be under resourced, especially when you think about the professional world, in the business world, etc. And so that's a kind of societal piece. How can we decenter men societally? And when we say decenter men, people do get very uncomfortable, because often, as with anything, when you are trying to rebalance where power sits fundamentally in society, it means somebody's got to share. You've either got to scoot your chair up for another chair to be added to the table, right? And not everybody wants to do that. The fifth aspect is interpersonal. So this is where quite often the majority of online discourse sits around interpersonal, i.e., relationships between heterosexual men and women. Because, by the way, like I alluded to earlier, even if you're not heterosexual, maleness is prioritized structurally on a societal level. And so you still can and may feel the need to decenter men, even if you're not attracted to men, having relationships with men, or marrying men. Okay. And so on an interpersonal level, for example, once you're married or dating or in a relationship with men, you have voluntarily entered a relationship of interdependence. So the reality is your husband occupies a central place in your life. Now, a lot of married women sometimes are initially defensive. There's often an emotive response when I've talked about this on TikTok, and when I wrote about it on Substack. I'm not saying that that means that you're a failure. I'm not saying that you should feel any type of way about that. Marriage is as old as it is old, okay? And people desire to get married. That's not probably going to change, all right? People get married now even though they don't have to for survival. People marry people they don't love. People marry for convenience. People marry for citizenship. There are all sorts of reasons why people desire marriage, and that includes women, okay? So the point I'm making here is that it's actually quite challenging to decenter a man that you have legally, emotionally, and in some cases, if you're religious, spiritually bound yourself to, not to mention the physical enmeshment that occurs, right? And so hopefully in a healthy relationship, there's mutual orientation, okay? But what we see quite often is the way that girls and women have been trained and conditioned from childhood is indeed to idolize, to prioritize, and to deify men in their minds and hearts. And so that's why so many women fundamentally at times struggle with having their own sense of self. They struggle with exercising self-authority because they believe fundamentally that their value and worth and identity is inextricably linked with being chosen by a man. And when you think about what women are encouraged to do, i.e. the performance, the sacrifice, and the servitude and the utility that you are required to offer in a marriage, it's very difficult to decenter that man. Because actually the reason why marriage as a system of power operates or functions is because the role of the woman is very, very clear. It's often domestic, for starters. All right? The role is very clear. The role is very clear. And so even for the women who are trying to reimagine the role of a wife, it's still very challenging. Why? Because societally, culturally, and in terms of religion, it is male-centered. So even when you're trying to make these changes as an individual woman, it can be extremely challenging because, like I say, the external structures and systems of power are not trying to support you in decentering men at all. Okay? And that is the reality. And so I think the biggest mistake, one of the mistakes I see in terms of the online discourse around decentering men, is that we assume that decentering men means exactly the same thing for everyone. And it doesn't. If you're a 22-year-old woman dating, it's going to look very different. If you're a married woman, it's going to look different. If you're a divorced woman, if you're a widow, if you are a woman who never wants marriage, okay, decentering men is going to look very different. That's why often, when I'm asked my opinion, I acknowledge that I have never been initiated or in the mind frame that men are the center of my life. I've never prioritized men. Now, I can tell you that in terms of ideological decentering, I've had to do that when I left religion. When I was in a religion, in fact, I had to decenter men because a lot of the beliefs and customs, the cultural customs, center men, and they kind of get enmeshed with religion, culture and religion together. So when I was in a religion, I did proactively decenter men ideologically. And then when I left religion, a lot of that was spurred. It was spurred by the fact that male religious authority was centering themselves. But they were doing it and saying that they were ordained by God to do it because they believe it's the same thing, that they are God's representatives, right? They speak for God and that they are, implementing his will. So it looks different for everyone. So even though I have never centered a human man in terms of my identity and my love life, there are other ways in which I had to decenter men. And there are ways today that I continue to decenter men, particularly as much as I can on a structural level, on an ideological level. And this is not about hating men. A lot of times people are willful and obtuse when it comes to this. No, it's because I believe that I am a fully fledged adult woman who is a human being that has my own identity. I do not have any, cognitive difficulties. I don't have an impairment. I am able to think for myself. I've fully got my thinking faculties. Okay. I trust myself. I aim to always operate in my self-authority, my rightful self-authority as a human being who is an adult. I see men as humans and I see them as my peers. They are not superior to me in any way whatsoever. I simply will not cognitively submit. I will never bow to a man, ideologically, emotionally, energetically. Right? That doesn't mean that you have to hate men or ignore them, right? Everybody has to find their lane when it comes to decentering men. Yeah, the practical expression will change depending upon who you are, where you are in life, what you want to do. But the underlying principle remains because remember, societally, maleness has been prioritized. It has power. It has more influence. It has more lean quite often than women on a societal level. So you can absolutely love a man because that's a human emotion. You can love, care for a man, whether it's a son, a brother, maybe even a romantic or sexual partner. Okay. You can choose to get married. Life is life, right? And actually for women who, are decentering men, maybe they are single. And so therefore decentering men, as I say, expresses itself in that way in terms of them being part of the 4B movement in Korea or remaining celibate. For those women, it's not about pretending that they don't want a relationship. I always chuckle when I see that come up in my comments because it's hilarious to me, really. Again, women who are functioning like adults, who know themselves, have a right to decide what they want for themselves. And they don't have an issue expressing themselves, articulating what they want. And so to rebut them by telling them you just don't know yourself or you're pretending, it's insulting, quite frankly. All right. It's insulting. Not everybody has that desire, and that's okay. So that's what I would share with you in terms of what decentering men, I believe, actually looks like. Okay, because really and truly, if you are a whole human being, especially when you're an adult, why would another adult human being become the organizing principle of your identity? And, if you've come from a religion where they're always encouraging you not to idolize anything but God, for example, it always strikes me as very, contradictory, especially because religious women in general, this is a generalization, because of the way the system of power works, that is religion, and then you add culture, you add the family system, a lot of them actually do idolize men in their thinking, in their actions, their lifestyle, and their habits, which is ironic because, of course, especially if you come from a Christian background, you're often told not to idolize anything other than the deity that you worship. And you can often see, though, it's reflected that, in fact, they do often idolize men, and they will encourage younger women to idolize men as well. And so the decentering of men, as I say, that often occurs is often by younger women for a large, and then you find older women, maybe they go for a divorce or a separation or something happens that triggers that piece around decentering the needs and the desires of that man in their heart, in their mind, and often actually in their bodies. So the question to ask yourself is who or what sits at the center of your life? And then you can basically work back from there. Now, if you want to do more of this work, I would encourage you to download the Invisible Contract Framework, which is somewhere in the link. It's completely free. You can privately reflect upon some of these invisible agreements that you might be obeying without realizing it. And you might find there are areas and opportunities for you to decenter men.